My last name is Reed, the little boy said, his small voice steady in a room that suddenly felt too quiet for anyone to breathe. The ballroom shimmered with crystal light and polished marble, a charity gala where the city's wealth gathered under chandeliers that scattered reflections like stars. But none of that mattered now because every head turned toward the child standing at the edge of a velvet rope, his sneakers slightly scuffed against the flawless floor, his jacket just a size too big, like it had been bought with hope rather than certainty. The security guard hesitated, unsure whether to laugh or escort him out, because children didn't just walk into events like this claiming names that belonged to men who built empires. "Kid, you can't be back here," the guard said, softer than expected, glancing toward the crowd for guidance that never came. The boy didn't move. He didn't look afraid. His fingers tightened around a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, like it had been held too many times for comfort. "My name is Noah Reed Carter," he added, and this time the words landed differently, not louder, but heavier, like they carried something none of the adults could immediately explain. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, subtle at first, then growing, curiosity dressed in expensive suits and polite smiles. Someone chuckled under their breath. Someone else whispered that it was probably a joke, a dare, a mistake. But then the double doors opened. The air shifted before anyone even saw him, that quiet change that happens when power enters a space without announcing itself. Alexander Reed stepped inside, his presence cutting clean through the noise, his tailored suit catching the light just enough to remind everyone why they were here, why his name meant something in rooms like this. Conversation stalled. Phones lowered. Even the guard straightened instinctively. Alexander didn't look at the boy right away. He moved through the crowd with the kind of calm that came from never needing to rush, acknowledging donors, offering brief nods, his attention controlled, deliberate. And yet something, maybe the silence, maybe the way people weren't speaking, pulled his gaze toward the edge of the room. Toward the child. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met. It wasn't dramatic. No music swelled. No one gasped. But something unspoken passed between them, something subtle enough to ignore, if Alexander had been the kind of man who ignored details. He wasn't. He slowed, just slightly. The boy didn't look away. Most children would have. Most people would have. But Noah stood there steady, like he had been waiting for this exact moment without knowing what it would feel like when it arrived. Before anything could be said, a woman's voice cut through the stillness, not loud, but urgent. "Noah!" She moved quickly, weaving through the crowd with quiet determination, her coat plain, her shoes worn but clean, her presence out of place and yet impossible to overlook. Emily Carter reached her son and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, grounding him without pulling him back. Her eyes lifted, and when they met Alexander's, there was no hesitation. Just recognition. Just something that had been carried for too long. "Don't talk to him," she said softly to Noah, but her gaze never left the man across from her. Alexander's expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted, a subtle tightening, a question forming before he allowed himself to ask it. Emily took a breath, steadying herself in a room that had no space for weakness. Then she spoke, her voice calm, almost quiet enough to miss if you weren't listening carefully. "You don't remember, but you should." The words didn't accuse. They didn't beg. They simply existed, hanging between them like a truth that had been waiting for the right moment to be seen. Around them, the crowd held its breath, unsure whether this was a scene or something far more real. Alexander studied her, not with recognition, but with precision, as if searching through years of controlled memories for a detail that refused to surface. "Security," he said, not raising his voice, but the word carried authority, the kind that moved people before they thought to question it. The guard stepped forward again, uncertain now, glancing between the CEO and the woman who didn't look like she planned to move. And then it happened, small, almost invisible. The paper slipped from Noah's hand. It drifted to the floor, unfolding just enough to reveal a name written in careful, uneven letters. Alexander's eyes flicked down, just for a second. But that second was enough. Enough for something to catch. Enough for something to begin. Alexander did not bend down right away, but his attention stayed fixed on the paper at his feet as if the entire room had narrowed to that single detail, the faint crease across its center, the careful way the letters had been written, uneven but deliberate, like someone had practiced them more than once before deciding they were good enough to show the world. The guard hesitated again, his hand hovering in the air between action and restraint, waiting for a signal that did not come. Emily's fingers tightened slightly on Noah's shoulder, not in fear, but in quiet resolve, as though she had already accepted whatever would happen next. Around them, the polished calm of the gala began to fracture into whispers, the kind that traveled quickly without anyone taking responsibility for them, names and guesses and assumptions threading through the air like invisible lines pulling everyone closer to the same unanswered question. Alexander finally moved, slow and precise, lowering himself just enough to pick up the paper without wrinkling it further, his movements controlled in a way that suggested he was not used to being uncertain. He unfolded it fully this time, and for a brief moment, his expression remained unchanged, the same composed stillness that had built his reputation, but something subtle shifted in his eyes, something that did not belong in a room like this. The name was simple. Clear. Noah Reed Carter. He read it once, then again, not because he did not understand it, but because understanding it too quickly felt like a mistake. Names were not accidents. Not in his world. Not with his name. It is a common last name. Someone murmured nearby, trying to fill the silence with logic, with something safe and dismissible. Alexander did not respond. He lifted his gaze slowly, not to the crowd, but to the boy studying him now with a level of attention that felt different, less distant, more searching. Noah did not look away. There was no arrogance in him, no challenge, just a quiet steadiness that felt out of place for a child his age, like he had learned early how to stand still when the world expected him to move. "Where did you get this name?" Alexander asked, his voice even, but lower than before, as if the question was meant only for the two of them, even though everyone was listening. Noah glanced up at his mother for a second, not for permission, but for reassurance, and Emily gave the smallest nod, the kind that carried years of unspoken conversations. "It is mine," Noah said simply. "It has always been mine." The answer did not satisfy the room, but it did something else instead. It made the silence heavier. Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his mind already moving ahead, connecting details that did not yet belong together. He turned slightly, just enough to catch the attention of his assistant standing near the edge of the crowd, a woman who understood instructions before they were spoken. "Find out where that name was registered," he said quietly, not breaking eye contact with the child. "Full records. Hospital. Birth certificate. Everything." She nodded once and disappeared into the background, her phone already in hand, her steps quick but unobtrusive. Emily exhaled slowly, as if a moment she had been holding on to for years had finally begun to unfold, though her expression did not soften. She did not step forward. She did not explain. She simply stood there, her presence steady, her silence intentional. "You could have chosen any name," Alexander continued, now directing his words toward her, his tone still controlled, but edged with something sharper, something closer to suspicion than curiosity. "Why that one?" Emily met his gaze without hesitation, her eyes calm in a way that did not match the tension around them. "I did not choose it," she said. "You did." The words landed quietly, but they carried more weight than anything else that had been said so far, because they did not ask him to believe, they asked him to remember. For the first time, Alexander did not have an immediate response. The certainty that usually guided him faltered, just slightly, like a memory trying to surface through something he had long ago decided to forget. Somewhere beyond the glass walls of the ballroom, the city lights flickered against the night, steady and distant, while inside, everything felt like it was beginning to shift in ways no one had planned for. And in the center of it all, a name that had always belonged to him now stood in front of him, spoken by a child who refused to let it be ignored. The room did not return to normal after her words, it only grew quieter, like something fragile had been placed in the center of it, and no one wanted to be the one who broke it first. Alexander remained still, the paper still in his hand, his thumb pressing lightly against the edge as if grounding himself in something tangible, while his thoughts moved somewhere less certain. He did not like uncertainty. He had built his entire life on clarity, on decisions made quickly and confidently, on facts that could be verified and controlled. But this was not presenting itself as a fact. Not yet. It was presenting itself as a possibility, and that alone was enough to slow him down. His assistant returned sooner than expected, her presence quiet but purposeful, stepping close enough to speak without drawing attention, though everyone was already watching. "The name was registered 6 years ago," she said under her breath, holding her tablet at an angle only he could see. "Mercy General Hospital. The birth certificate lists the mother as Emily Carter. The father Field." She paused for a fraction of a second, not because she was unsure, but because she understood the weight of what she was about to say. "Was left blank at the time of registration." Alexander's eyes did not leave the screen as he took in the information, each detail sliding into place with a precision that should have brought clarity, but instead only deepened the question. "Continue," he said quietly. She nodded, scrolling once. 3 days after the birth, the record was updated through a hospital administrative override. The middle name Reed was added. The authorization came through a foundation account tied to Reed Enterprises. It was approved automatically under your philanthropic healthcare program. The words settled slowly, like pieces of a puzzle that no longer fit the way they were supposed to. Alexander finally looked up, his gaze shifting from the screen to Emily, searching her face now not for recognition, but for confirmation, for something that would explain how a system he controlled had made a decision he did not remember making. Emily did not move. She had expected this moment. "You funded the hospital wing," she said calmly, her voice steady, not defensive, not emotional, just clear. "You set the policy. Newborns without complete documentation were processed under your foundation until everything was finalized. They asked for a name. I gave them his first and last. They said he needed a middle name for the system. They suggested using the donor registry." She let the explanation sit there, simple and undeniable. "Your name was already there." A quiet shift moved through the crowd, not loud, but noticeable, like a collective realization forming at the same time. This was no longer a coincidence. It was something more precise. Something structured. Something that had followed rules. Alexander's jaw tightened again, but this time it was not from dismissal. It was from recognition of a different kind, the kind that came when a detail aligned too perfectly to ignore. He looked back at Noah, really looked this time, not as a stranger, not as a disruption, but as a presence that had somehow existed within his world without his awareness. The boy stood the same way, steady, patient, as if he had already waited long enough for this moment to arrive. "That does not explain everything," Alexander said, his voice quieter now, less commanding, more deliberate, like he was choosing each word carefully instead of letting them come naturally. "A name can be assigned. It does not mean anything beyond that." Emily nodded slightly, as if she had expected that answer too. "You are right," she said. "A name alone does not mean anything." She reached into her bag then, not hurried, not dramatic, just a simple movement that carried more weight than any raised voice could have. She pulled out a small envelope, worn at the edges like the paper Noah had been holding, and held it out, not forcing it into his hand, just offering it, leaving the choice to him. "That is why I did not come here to talk about a name," she added quietly. "I came because you told me once that if something ever mattered, I should not stay silent about it." The sentence did not accuse. It did not demand. But it carried something far more dangerous than either of those things. It carried memory. Alexander stared at the envelope for a moment longer than necessary, something unfamiliar pressing against the edges of his control, something that felt like recognition but refused to fully form. Slowly, he reached out and took it, the paper light in his hand but impossibly heavy in what it might contain. Around them, the gala continued in appearance only, the music still playing softly, the lights still shining, but no one was truly paying attention anymore. Because at the center of it all, a past that had been carefully buried was beginning to surface, one detail at a time, and for the first time in years, Alexander Reed was not certain what he would find when he finally looked at it. Alexander did not open the envelope immediately, and that hesitation said more than any reaction could have, because he was not a man who delayed decisions, not in business, not in life, yet now his fingers rested against the edge of the paper as if he understood that once opened, something irreversible would follow. The soft music in the background continued, but it no longer belonged to the moment. It felt distant, disconnected, like it was playing for a different room entirely. His gaze lifted briefly to Emily again, searching her expression for doubt, for uncertainty, for anything that might suggest this was a misunderstanding he could resolve with logic, but there was none. She stood with the same quiet certainty, not demanding, not pleading, simply present, as if she had already done everything she needed to do by showing up. Noah shifted slightly beside her, not impatient, not restless, just adjusting his weight from one foot to the other, his small hand brushing lightly against his mother's sleeve, a simple gesture that spoke of familiarity, of trust, of a bond that had been built without question. Alexander noticed it. He noticed everything now. Slowly, he opened the envelope. The paper inside was folded once, carefully, like it had been handled many times but always with care. He unfolded it with deliberate precision, his movements controlled even as the tension around him grew. It was a photograph. Not recent. The edges were softened with time, the colors slightly faded, but the image was clear enough to remove any doubt about what it showed. A hospital room. Dim lighting. A woman sitting on the edge of a narrow bed, her hair loosely tied back, her face pale with exhaustion but unmistakably calm. Emily. Younger, but the same. In her arms, a newborn wrapped in a light blue blanket, his tiny face barely visible beneath the fabric. And standing beside her, partially turned toward the camera, was a man in a dark suit jacket, his sleeves rolled just slightly, as if he had not planned to stay but had stayed anyway. His hand rested on the edge of the bed, close enough to the child to suggest presence, but not quite touching. His expression was not the composed one the world knew. It was unguarded. Softer. Real. Alexander stared at the image without blinking, his mind not racing this time, but slowing, each detail settling into place with a clarity that felt impossible to deny. He knew that room. Mercy General. He had visited it dozens of times during the early days of the Foundation expansion, walking through wards, reviewing operations, ensuring standards were met. But this was not one of those visits. This was something else. Something personal. Something he had not filed away with the rest of his controlled memories. His fingers tightened slightly around the photograph, not enough to crease it, but enough to betray the shift happening beneath his composure. The room around him seemed to fade, the quiet conversations, the soft music, the presence of dozens of people who had once commanded his full attention. None of it reached him now. "You stay," Emily said softly, her voice cutting through the silence in a way that did not demand attention, but claimed it anyway. Alexander's eyes lifted from the photograph to her face again, and for the first time, there was something in his expression that had not been there before. Not confusion. Not denial. Something closer to recognition, though still incomplete, like a memory forming just beyond reach. "It was late," she continued, her tone steady, not emotional, just factual. "You were supposed to leave after the meeting. But you saw me in the hallway. I was alone. They had already discharged me, but I had nowhere to go that night." The words did not rush. They unfolded slowly, each one carrying a piece of a moment that had existed whether he remembered it or not. "You said the hospital should not release anyone without making sure they were safe. So you stayed. You waited until morning." Alexander's jaw shifted slightly, the smallest sign of something breaking through the controlled surface he had maintained for so long. The image in his hand was no longer just evidence. It was a doorway. And it was beginning to open. Noah looked up at him then, not with expectation, not with accusation, just with quiet curiosity, as if he was watching something important happen without fully understanding it yet. The resemblance, subtle before, now felt impossible to ignore. Not in features alone, but in the way the boy held himself, the stillness, the awareness. Alexander exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he was holding, and for the first time since the moment began, he did not look like the man who controlled everything in the room. He looked like someone standing at the edge of a truth he could no longer choose to overlook. Alexander did not speak right away, and that silence felt different now, not controlled, not intentional, but necessary, as if anything he said too quickly would break something that had just begun to surface. His eyes dropped back to the photograph, tracing the details again, slower this time, not as a businessman analyzing evidence, but as someone trying to recognize a moment that had once belonged to him. The angle of his posture in the image, the looseness in his expression, the way his hand rested near the child without hesitation, none of it matched the version of himself he presented to the world. That man in the photograph had stayed. That man had chosen to remain in a room that offered him nothing in return. "I remember the policy," he said finally, his voice quieter than before, less certain, as if he was testing the truth as he spoke it. "No patient leaves without a safe plan. That was standard." Emily nodded slightly, acknowledging the fact without challenging it. "Yes," she said. "But policies do not sit beside someone at 3 in the morning." The words were not sharp, but they landed with precision, separating what he had built from what he had done. Alexander's grip on the photograph tightened just a fraction, and for the first time, the memory did not feel distant. It felt close. Too close. A hallway. Fluorescent lights. The quiet hum of machines in the background. He could almost hear it now. He could almost see it. A woman sitting alone, not asking for help, not expecting anything. And himself, pausing when he should have kept walking. That part felt familiar. That part felt real. His breath slowed, steady but deeper, as if his body was adjusting to something his mind had not yet fully accepted. "You said you had nowhere to go," he continued, his eyes still on the photograph, but his focus shifting inward, towards something that was no longer entirely hidden. Emily did not interrupt. She did not need to. "It was winter," she added softly, her voice calm, almost distant, like she was recalling something that had already been lived through and survived. 32 degrees outside. I had been discharged early because they needed the bed. I did not argue. I never did. The details settled into him with unexpected weight. 32 degrees. Freezing. The kind of cold that did not just touch the surface, but stayed with you. He closed his eyes briefly, not to escape, but to hold on to the fragment that was beginning to form. "You brought coffee," Emily said after a moment, her tone unchanged, still simple, still factual. "Black. You did not ask what I wanted. You said it was the only thing that kept you awake during long nights." A faint shift passed through Alexander's expression, something softer, something almost unrecognizable to anyone who knew him only as a name, as a figure, as a presence in rooms like this. He opened his eyes again, and this time when he looked at her, it was not with distance. It was with connection, fragile but undeniable. "I stayed until morning," he said quietly, not as a question, but as a realization. Emily nodded once. "You stayed until he stopped crying," she replied. The sentence was simple, but it changed everything. Alexander's gaze moved slowly, almost instinctively, from her to Noah, who stood there watching, not confused, not overwhelmed, just present, as if he had always known this moment would come, even if he did not understand why. The child's eyes met his again, steady, unafraid, carrying something that no document, no record, no system could fully explain. Recognition. Not learned. Not taught. Just there. Alexander felt it then, not as a conclusion, not as a fact confirmed by data, but as something deeper, something that did not require permission to exist. The room around them seemed to fall further away, the expectations, the structure, the certainty he had relied on for so long, all of it fading in the presence of something far more personal. Why did you not come sooner? He asked, his voice lower now, stripped of its usual authority, carrying instead a question that did not belong to the CEO, but to the man in the photograph. Emily's expression did not change, but there was a quiet shift in her eyes, something that reflected both strength and understanding. Because you did not forget, she said gently. You chose not to remember. The words did not accuse him. They did not blame him. But they removed the last layer of distance he had been holding onto. And in that moment, standing under the same lights that had once defined his world, Alexander Reed understood that the past he had left behind had never truly left him at all. The words did not echo, but they stayed, settling into the space between them with a weight that could not be dismissed, because they were not loud, not dramatic, just true in a way that did not need to be proven. Alexander did not argue. For the first time since the moment began, he had nothing immediate to counter with, no structured response, no logical defense, just the quiet realization that some things were not forgotten by accident. He looked down at the photograph again, but now it was different, no longer a distant image, but a fragment of something he had once lived and then carefully set aside. His reflection in the polished floor beneath him felt unfamiliar, like the version of himself standing there did not fully match the one he had spent years becoming. The gala continued in form only, glasses clinked softly in the distance, conversations resumed in hushed tones, but none of it reached him in a way that mattered. I do not remember everything, he said finally, his voice steady but stripped of certainty, each word measured, not for control, but for honesty. But I remember enough to know that I would not have stayed without a reason. Emily did not respond immediately, giving the silence space to settle, as if she understood that this was not a moment that needed to be rushed. Noah shifted slightly beside her, his small hand now resting loosely against her coat, not seeking reassurance, just present, just grounded in a reality that had always been his. You stayed because you saw me, she said softly. Not as a case. Not as a responsibility. Just as a person who needed someone to stay. The simplicity of the explanation carried more weight than any accusation could have. Alexander's gaze moved from the photograph to her again, and there was something new there now, something that had not existed before this moment, something that did not belong to the version of himself that dealt in contracts and negotiations. Recognition was no longer distant. It was forming. And him? He asked, his voice quieter, almost careful, as if the question itself mattered more than the answer. Emily followed his gaze to Noah, her expression softening just slightly, not with vulnerability, but with something steadier, something earned. He cried all night, she said. The nurses were busy. The hallways were loud. I was exhausted. I did not know what to do. The memory unfolded. Slowly, not rushed, not dramatized, just presented the way it had happened. You did not try to fix it. You did not call anyone. You just sat there. You held him. You said sometimes people do not need solutions. They just need someone who does not leave. The words settled into Alexander with a clarity that bypassed logic entirely, reaching something deeper, something he had not needed to access in a long time. He could see it now, not fully, not perfectly, but enough. The quiet room. The small weight of a newborn in his arms. The unfamiliar stillness that came with staying instead of leaving. It was not a memory he had erased. It was one he had buried under everything that came after. His breath shifted, slower now, more deliberate, as if he was adjusting to the presence of something he had not allowed himself to acknowledge. And then I left, he said, not as a question, but as a conclusion that felt inevitable. Emily nodded once. In the morning, she confirmed. You had a meeting. You said it was important. There was no bitterness in her tone, no accusation, just the continuation of a moment that had ended the way most moments did, quietly, without ceremony. You asked if I would be all right, she added. I said yes. That was enough for you. Alexander's jaw shifted slightly, not in denial, but in understanding, the kind that came too late to change what had already happened. His eyes moved back to Noah, really seeing him now, not as a question, not as a possibility, but as a presence that had existed in the space between that night and this moment. 6 years? 6 years of absence measured not in time, but in moments missed, in questions unasked, in a name that had been carried without him. The weight of it did not show in a dramatic gesture. It settled quietly, firmly, in the way he stood, in the way his shoulders no longer held the same rigid control. "You did not come here for money," he said after a moment, not because he doubted it, but because he needed to hear it confirmed in the space between them. Emily met his gaze without hesitation. "No," she said simply. "I came because he deserves to know where he comes from." The sentence did not demand anything. It did not ask for a reaction. It simply placed the truth where it could no longer be ignored. Noah looked up at Alexander again, his expression unchanged, calm, steady, as if he had always known that this moment was not about proving anything, but about being seen. And for the first time, Alexander did not look away. Alexander did not move closer right away, but something in the way he stood had already changed. The distance he had carefully maintained no longer felt intentional, more like a habit he had not yet adjusted to losing. The photograph remained in his hand, but his attention was no longer on it. It had shifted fully to the boy in front of him, to the quiet presence that had not demanded anything, had not interrupted, had simply waited. Waiting, he realized, required a kind of patience he had never needed to understand before. "How old are you?" he asked, his voice steady but softer now, not carrying across the room, meant only for the child who met his gaze without hesitation. 6. Noah answered, his tone simple, certain, as if the number itself mattered less than the fact that he was being asked. Alexander nodded once, absorbing the answer in a way that felt heavier than it should have. 6 years? He did not repeat it out loud, but it settled in him, not as a calculation, but as a realization of time that had passed without him noticing, without him choosing to notice. "Do you know why you are here tonight?" he continued, not testing, not challenging, just asking. Noah glanced briefly at Emily, not for permission, but for grounding, then looked back at Alexander. "My mom said I should meet you," he replied. "She said you would understand my name." The words were simple, but they carried a quiet certainty that did not need explanation. Alexander's breath shifted again, slower, more deliberate, as if he was adjusting not just to the situation, but to the weight of being seen in a way he had not prepared for. He looked at Emily then, searching her face not for answers, but for alignment, for confirmation that what was happening was real, not constructed, not manipulated. She did not step forward. She did not fill the silence. She allowed it to exist, trusting that he would reach what he needed to on his own. That trust felt unfamiliar and undeserved. "You told him that," Alexander said quietly, more statement than question. Emily shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "I told him the truth. That names mean something when they are not given by accident." The distinction was small, but it shifted everything. Alexander looked back at Noah, really seeing him now, not just in features or resemblance, but in presence, in the way he stood without shrinking, without performing, just existing as he was. It was not confidence. It was something steadier. Something learned. "And what do you think it means?" Alexander asked, his voice lower now, not because he needed to control the room, but because the question itself felt personal in a way he had not expected. Noah thought for a moment, not rushing, not guessing, just considering the question the way children sometimes did when they had been taught to listen before answering. "I think it means you were there," he said finally. "Even if you did not stay." The answer landed with a quiet precision that no adult in the room could have delivered the same way, because it did not accuse, it did not judge, it simply stated what felt true from a place untouched by expectation. Alexander's jaw shifted slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition of something he had not allowed himself to define. He had always measured presence in outcomes, in results, in actions that could be documented and verified. But this was different. This was a moment that had existed without structure, without record, and yet it had left something behind. Something that had grown without him. "I did stay," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else, as if testing the memory now that it had begun to take shape. Noah nodded once, accepting the statement without question, as if it aligned with something he already believed. "That is why my name is not a mistake," he added. The sentence was simple, but it carried a clarity that cut through every doubt that had filled the room earlier. Alexander exhaled slowly, the breath deeper than before, as if something in him had shifted from resistance to acceptance, not fully, not completely, but enough to change the way he stood, the way he looked, the way he listened. Around them, the room remained still, the quiet attention of dozens of people now focused not on status or wealth, but on something far more human, something that did not belong to the structure they understood. Emily watched the exchange without interrupting, her expression calm, not surprised, as if she had always known that this moment would unfold this way once it began. Alexander lowered the photograph slightly, no longer needing to rely on it as proof, because the truth in front of him was no longer something he could question in the same way. "What do you want from me?" he asked after a moment, his voice steady again, but different now, not distant, not guarded, just direct. Emily met his gaze, her answer immediate, but gentle. "Nothing for me," she said. Then her eyes shifted briefly to Noah, and back. "Just do not look away this time." The words did not ask for more than that. They did not demand promises or guarantees. But they removed the one thing he had relied on before. The ability to walk away without seeing what he was leaving behind. And this time, standing under the same lights, in the same world that had once made it easy to forget, Alexander Reed did not look away. The space between them no longer felt like distance, it felt like something waiting to be crossed, not with words, but with a decision that could not be undone once made. Alexander did not glance at the crowd this time, did not look for approval or reaction, because for the first time in years, the room did not matter. The only thing that remained clear was the boy standing in front of him and the woman who had chosen to bring him here without asking for anything in return. That absence of demand unsettled him more than any expectation could have, because it left him with nothing to negotiate, nothing to control, only a choice he had to make on his own. He lowered the photograph completely now, his hand steady, but his posture no longer rigid, as if something within him had shifted from defense to presence. "I will not look away," he said, his voice quiet, but firm enough that it did not need to be repeated. The words did not carry the authority of a promise made in a boardroom, they carried something simpler, something more personal, the kind of commitment that did not come with conditions. Noah watched him closely, not searching for perfection, not expecting certainty, just listening, the way he had listened from the beginning, patient in a way that did not belong to someone his age. Alexander took a small step forward then, not rushed, not dramatic, just enough to close part of the distance that had existed between them. It was a simple movement, but it changed the balance of the moment entirely. He was no longer observing. He was participating. "Noah," he said, testing the name aloud, not as a title, but as something that belonged to the child in front of him, something that now carried meaning beyond a record or a document. The boy nodded once, acknowledging it, accepting it without hesitation, as if the name had always been waiting to be spoken this way. "Do you know what my name means?" Alexander asked, not as a test, but as a continuation, as if he was learning how to speak in a space where answers mattered differently. Noah thought for a moment, then shook his head slightly. "My mom said it means something important," he replied. Alexander exhaled softly, a faint shift in his expression that carried something almost unfamiliar, something that did not belong to calculation or control. "It means responsibility," he said, his voice steady, but quieter now, as if the word itself required care. "It means that when you put your name on something, you do not walk away from it." The sentence settled between them, not as a lesson, but as a realization spoken out loud for the first time. Emily watched without interrupting, her expression unchanged, but her eyes holding a quiet understanding, as if she had been waiting not for the answer, but for him to reach it on his own. Noah listened carefully, then nodded again, the meaning not fully understood, but accepted in the way children sometimes accepted truths they would grow into later. "Then you should not walk away from me," he said simply. The words were not demanding. They were not emotional. They were clear, direct, and impossibly honest. Alexander did not respond immediately, but this time the silence did not feel uncertain. It felt deliberate, as if he was allowing the weight of the moment to settle exactly where it belonged. He looked at Noah, not through him, not past him, but at him, and for the first time, there was no distance left in his gaze. "I will not," he said finally, the words steady, not loud, but undeniable in their intent. Around them, the room remained quiet, not out of politeness, but because something real was unfolding in a space that rarely allowed it. The lights still reflected off polished surfaces, the music still played softly, but none of it interrupted what was happening at the center of it all. Alexander extended his hand then, not in a formal gesture, not in the way he greeted investors or partners, but simply, openly, leaving the choice to Noah the same way Emily had left it to him. The boy looked at his hand for a brief moment, then reached out and placed his smaller hand into it without hesitation. The contact was simple, brief, but it carried more weight than anything that had been said. It was not confirmation. It was not proof. It was something quieter, something that did not need to be announced. Emily exhaled softly, the smallest release of tension, not relief, but acknowledgement that the moment had shifted in the only way that mattered. Alexander did not let go immediately, not because he needed to hold on, but because for the first time, he understood what it meant to stay. And this time, he did not step back. The contact between their hands was brief, but it lingered in a way that neither of them immediately understood, as if something had quietly shifted from possibility into reality without needing to announce itself. Alexander released Noah's hand slowly, not pulling away, just allowing the moment to settle into something that could exist beyond a single gesture. He straightened slightly, not returning to his previous composure, but adjusting to a new one, something less rigid, less distant, something that did not rely on control to feel stable. The room around them began to breathe again, soft conversations returning in cautious tones, glasses lifted with quieter movements. But the attention had not fully drifted away, it hovered, watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Alexander glanced toward his assistant, who stood a few steps back, still attentive, still ready, but now uncertain in a way that mirrored the shift in him. "Cancel the rest of my evening," he said, his voice calm, but decisive, the kind of instruction that did not require explanation. She hesitated for just a fraction of a second, not questioning the order, but recognizing its weight, then nodded once and moved quickly to carry it out. That single decision did more than clear his schedule. It redrew the boundaries of what mattered in that moment. Emily noticed it, not with surprise, but with quiet acknowledgement, as if she understood that staying was no longer a concept for him, it was becoming an action. Noah looked up at Alexander again, his expression unchanged, still calm, still observant, but there was something new now, a subtle ease, like a question had been answered without needing to be fully explained. "Are you leaving?" Noah asked, his voice simple, not anxious, just curious, the kind of question that came from someone who had learned not to assume anything without confirmation. Alexander shook his head slightly, the movement immediate, instinctive. "No," he said. "Not tonight." The words were quiet, but they carried a clarity that did not leave room for doubt. Noah nodded once, accepting the answer the same way he had accepted everything else, without hesitation, without needing reassurance beyond what was said. Alexander glanced at Emily then, not searching, not questioning, just looking, as if trying to understand the path that had led her here, the choices she had made in silence, the years she had carried without interruption. "Where have you been living?" he asked, his tone steady, but different now, not distant, not transactional, just direct in a way that suggested he intended to listen to the answer. Emily did not hesitate. "Westbrook Apartments," she replied. 2 miles from here." The detail was simple, but it grounded the moment in reality, in distance measured not in miles alone, but in choices, in separation, in time that could have been bridged but was not. Alexander absorbed it quietly, his mind no longer racing ahead, no longer calculating outcomes, just taking in what was in front of him. "You brought him here tonight," he said, more as a reflection than a question. Emily nodded. "Because it was time," she answered. There was no added explanation, no justification, just a statement that carried its own certainty. Alexander looked at Noah again, the weight of the years between them no longer abstract, no longer theoretical, but present, standing in front of him in the form of a child who had grown without him, but had still somehow carried his name. "Have you eaten?" he asked after a moment, the question simple, almost ordinary, but it marked a shift that could not be undone. Noah blinked slightly, surprised, not by the question itself, but by the way it was asked, not as a formality, not as a gesture, but as something that mattered. "A little," he said. Alexander nodded, then glanced briefly toward the tables set along the far side of the room, the catered arrangements still untouched by most, pristine, excessive in the way events like this often were. "Come with me," he said, not as an order, not as a command, but as an invitation, one that did not assume acceptance. Noah looked at Emily, not for permission, but for understanding, and she gave a small nod, her expression calm, trusting the direction the moment was taking. Alexander turned slightly, not walking ahead, not leading in the way he usually did, but moving beside them, adjusting his pace to match Noah's without thinking about it, without needing to be told. It was a small change, almost invisible to anyone not paying attention, but it carried something significant, something that spoke louder than any declaration could have. As they moved through the room, the distance between them no longer felt like something to overcome. It felt like something that had already begun to close. And for the first time in years, Alexander Reed was not walking toward a deal, or a decision, or an outcome. He was simply walking forward, choosing to stay in a moment he could no longer ignore. The tables along the far side of the ballroom were untouched in a way that felt almost deliberate, rows of carefully arranged plates and polished silverware reflecting the soft glow of overhead lights, everything pristine, everything prepared for people who had not yet decided they were hungry. Alexander slowed as they approached, not out of uncertainty, but because the moment no longer felt like something to move through quickly. He reached for a plate, his movements measured, not out of habit this time, but out of awareness, as if even something as simple as this required intention. "What do you like?" he asked, glancing at Noah, not assuming, not deciding for him, just asking in a way that made the question matter. Noah looked at the table, taking in the choices with quiet curiosity, not overwhelmed, just careful, the way he had been since the beginning. "Something simple," he said after a moment. "I like things I know." The answer was small, but it carried something deeper, something that spoke of routine, of familiarity, of a life built on what could be counted on. Alexander nodded once, understanding more than the words themselves, and selected a few items, nothing elaborate, nothing excessive, just enough to place on the plate with care. He handed it to Noah without ceremony, not as a gesture to be noticed, but as something that felt natural in the moment. Noah accepted it with both hands, steady, respectful, as if he understood that this was not about the food, but about the act itself. Emily watched quietly, her gaze shifting between them, not interrupting, not guiding, just allowing the moment to exist without shaping it. Alexander picked up a second plate, this time glancing at her briefly. "You should eat too," he said, his tone even, not instructing, just stating something that felt obvious in a way he had not acknowledged before. Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of refusal, but out of habit, the kind that came from putting someone else first for so long that it became automatic. Then she nodded once and accepted the plate when he offered it. The three of them stood there for a moment, not speaking, just existing in a space that had shifted from something formal to something quietly personal. Around them, the room continued its soft return to normal, but the distance between this moment and the rest of the evening remained clear, like two separate worlds sharing the same space without overlapping. Noah took a small bite, then glanced up at Alexander again, not questioning, not uncertain, just present. "Do you live here?" he asked, his voice calm, curious in the way children often were when they were trying to understand something new. Alexander shook his head slightly. No, he replied. I work here sometimes. My office is in the building. Noah nodded, absorbing the information without adding to it, as if he was placing it somewhere in his understanding, piece by piece. Is it big? He asked after a moment. The question was simple, but it carried no awe, no expectation, just genuine curiosity. Alexander considered it for a second, not answering automatically. It is large, he said. But that does not always make it important. The words came more slowly than usual, as if he was choosing them differently now, measuring not for impact, but for meaning. Noah seemed to think about that, his expression thoughtful, then nodded again, accepting the answer in the same quiet way he had accepted everything else. Emily shifted her weight slightly, her attention still on them, her presence steady, not stepping in, not needing to. Alexander noticed it, the way she allowed space without losing connection, the way she trusted the moment without controlling it. It was a kind of strength he recognized now, one that did not rely on visibility. You said you lived 2 miles away, he said after a moment, turning his attention back to her. How do you get around? Emily answered simply. Bus. Sometimes I walk. The details settled into him without resistance, without judgment, just as a fact that existed whether he had known it or not. 2 miles. A distance he would have considered insignificant in another context now felt different, measured in effort, in time, in the quiet decisions that shaped everyday life. He nodded once, not offering a solution, not interrupting with anything that would shift the balance of what was being said. For once, listening was enough. Noah finished another bite, then looked up again, his gaze steady, direct. Will I see you again? He asked. The question was not rushed, not anxious, just clear, the kind of question that did not carry fear, but did carry importance. Alexander did not look away. He did not hesitate. Yes, he said. The answer came without pause, without condition, grounded in something that had already begun to change. Noah nodded once, accepting it, not asking for more, not needing reassurance beyond what had been given. And in that simple exchange, something settled into place, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that did not need to be proven. For the first time, the future was not a projection or a plan. It was something that had been spoken into existence with a single word that neither of them chose to doubt. The word yes did not fade after it was spoken, it stayed, quiet but steady, settling into the space between them with a kind of permanence that did not need to be repeated. Noah did not question it, did not ask when or how, he simply accepted it the way he had accepted everything else, without doubt, without hesitation, as if he understood that some answers were meant to be trusted the first time they were given. Alexander watched him for a moment longer, not analyzing, not measuring, just observing in a way that felt unfamiliar but necessary, like he was learning something he had never needed to learn before. The boy finished another bite of food, calm, unhurried, his attention moving naturally between what was in front of him and the man who had just changed something without fully realizing it. Emily stood beside him, her posture relaxed but present, not intervening, not guiding, simply allowing the moment to continue without shaping it. That restraint did not go unnoticed. Alexander shifted his attention to her, studying her expression with a different kind of focus now, not searching for answers, but recognizing the weight of what she had carried without asking him to share it until now. You have been doing this alone, he said, not as a question, but as a statement that felt incomplete the moment it was spoken. Emily nodded slightly. Yes, she replied. There was no emphasis, no added explanation, just a simple acknowledgement of something that had already been lived through. Alexander exhaled quietly, the sound almost imperceptible, but it carried something heavier than before, something that did not belong to regret exactly, but existed somewhere close to it. He glanced at Noah again, the distance of 6 years no longer abstract, no longer something that could be reduced to numbers or timelines, but something that existed in missed moments, in questions never asked, in a life that had continued without him. What do you like to do? He asked, his voice steady but softer, directed at Noah in a way that felt intentional, like he was choosing to understand instead of assume. Noah looked up, considering the question briefly. "I like drawing," he said. "And building things. Not big things. Just small ones that work." The answer was simple, but it carried a quiet pride, not in size or scale, but in function, in something that made sense when it came together. Alexander nodded, absorbing the detail without trying to expand it into something else. "That matters," he said. "Things that work are important." Noah smiled slightly at that, not broadly, not exaggerated, just enough to show that the answer had been received in the way it was meant. Emily watched the exchange, her expression unchanged, but her eyes softer now, not with relief, but with recognition that something real was beginning to take shape. Alexander shifted his weight slightly, the formality of the evening no longer defining his movements, his posture no longer built for observation, but for presence. "I would like to see that," he added after a moment, his tone steady, not making a promise beyond what he could hold, but offering something that felt real. "Your drawings. The things you build." Noah looked at him carefully, not surprised, not overwhelmed, just thoughtful, as if he was measuring the words not for perfection, but for sincerity. Then he nodded once. "Okay," he said. The agreement was simple, but it carried the same quiet certainty that had defined every part of him from the beginning. Alexander turned his attention back to Emily, his expression no longer guarded, but not fully open either, something in between, something still forming. "I will arrange transportation for you tonight," he said, his voice even, but deliberate. "You should not have to take the bus back this late." Emily hesitated for a moment, not rejecting the offer, but adjusting to it, to the shift in dynamic that did not feel transactional, but still required her to consider it carefully. Then she nodded once. "Thank you," she said. There was no resistance in her voice, just acknowledgement, the kind that accepted help without surrendering independence. Alexander inclined his head slightly, accepting the response without adding to it, without turning it into something larger than it needed to be. Noah finished the last of his food and set the plate down carefully, his movements neat, practiced, as if he understood the importance of small actions being done with care. He looked up again, his gaze steady, unchanged. "Do you have a place where I can draw?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried something new, not just curiosity, but expectation, the kind that formed when something had already begun. Alexander did not hesitate. "Yes," he said. "I do." And this time, when the word settled into the space between them, it did not stand alone. It carried with it the quiet beginning of something that no longer belonged to the past, but to what would come next. The question did not feel small, even though it sounded like one, because it carried a direction, a quiet shift from what had been discovered to what could now be built. Alexander held Noah's gaze for a moment after answering, not with hesitation, but with a kind of awareness that every word now had weight beyond the moment itself. "It is upstairs," he added, his tone steady, not inviting in the usual sense, but opening a space that had not existed before. Noah nodded once, absorbing the answer without excitement or doubt, just acceptance, as if the possibility of going there had already begun to take shape in his mind. Emily glanced between them, her expression thoughtful, not cautious, but aware of the transition unfolding, from a public moment into something more private, something that would not have the same distance or protection. "We do not have to go now," she said gently, her voice calm, not resisting, but grounding the moment in choice rather than momentum. Alexander understood what she meant without needing further explanation. The evening had already shifted more than expected, and what came next should not feel rushed or decided by circumstance alone. He nodded once. "You are right," he replied. "Not tonight." The words were simple, but they carried intention, not delay, but respect for the space that needed to exist between recognition and action. Noah looked between them, not confused, not impatient, just listening, his understanding shaped by what had already been said, not by what had been withheld. "Can I still come?" he asked, his voice steady, not pressing, just confirming something that mattered to him. Alexander did not hesitate. Yes, he said again. You can. The repetition did not weaken the promise. It strengthened it, grounding it further into something that would not be easily undone. Noah accepted it with the same quiet certainty, his attention returning to the present without needing more explanation. The moment did not stretch or strain after that, it settled, like something that had found its place without forcing it. Alexander turned slightly, signaling for his assistant once more, who approached quickly but without drawing attention. Arrange a car, he said quietly. Take them home. Make sure it is direct. She nodded immediately, already moving to carry out the instruction, her efficiency unchanged, though her understanding of the situation had clearly shifted. Emily watched the exchange, her posture steady, her expression thoughtful, not overwhelmed, not uncertain, just aware of the balance that had formed and the care it required to maintain. Thank you, she said again, her voice soft but sincere, not out of obligation, but acknowledgement of something that had not been offered lightly. Alexander inclined his head slightly, accepting the gratitude without expanding it into something larger, understanding now that not every moment needed to be filled with explanation or reassurance. Noah stepped a little closer to him then, not out of hesitation, but naturally, as if the space between them no longer needed to be measured in the same way. I can bring my drawings next time, he said, his tone calm, but carrying a quiet anticipation, the kind that did not rush ahead, but stayed grounded in what had been agreed upon. Alexander allowed a faint shift in his expression, not quite a smile, but something close, something that belonged more to the man in the photograph than the one who had entered the room earlier that evening. I would like that, he said. The words were simple, but they carried a meaning that extended beyond the surface, a willingness to see, to understand, to remain present in something that could not be reduced to a single moment. The assistant returned briefly, confirming that the car was ready, her voice low, efficient, respectful of the space that had formed. Emily nodded once, acknowledging it, then looked at Noah, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, not guiding, just connecting. It is time, she said softly. Noah nodded, then looked back at Alexander one more time, not searching for anything new, just holding the connection that had been established. Good night, he said. Alexander did not step back this time. He did not return to distance. Good night, Noah, he replied, the name spoken with the same quiet intention it had carried before. Emily met his gaze once more, her expression steady, not needing to say more than what had already been understood. Then she turned, guiding Noah gently toward the exit, their steps unhurried, their presence no longer out of place, but simply part of the space they were leaving behind. Alexander remained where he was, watching them go, not with the detachment he had once mastered, but with a stillness that held something new, something that did not belong to the past he had avoided, but to the future he had just chosen to face. And for the first time, as the distance between them grew again, it did not feel like separation. It felt like something waiting to be continued. The doors closed quietly behind them, and the soft echo of their departure lingered longer than the sound itself, as if the room needed time to adjust to their absence. Alexander remained where he stood, the photograph still in his hand, though he was no longer looking at it. The space they had occupied felt different now, not empty, but changed, like something had been placed there that could not be removed simply because they were gone. Around him, the gala slowly resumed its rhythm, conversations rising back to their usual tone, glasses lifted, laughter returning in careful waves, but none of it reached him in the same way it had before. He had spent years mastering how to be present without being affected, how to move through rooms like this without carrying anything away with him. Tonight that control had slipped, not dramatically, not visibly, but completely. He walked toward the tall windows at the far end of the ballroom, the city lights stretching out below in quiet patterns, steady and distant, a view he had seen countless times without truly seeing it. His reflection in the glass looked familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, the same composed exterior, the same measured posture, but something behind it had shifted, something that did not fit the image he had built for himself. He unfolded the photograph again, holding it up to the faint reflection of the city beyond, and this time he did not search for evidence or explanation. He simply allowed himself to see it. The man in the image was not performing. He was not calculating. He was not deciding what mattered based on outcome or return. He was just there. And that presence, brief as it had been, had carried forward in a way he had never accounted for. "You did not forget," he said quietly to his own reflection, the words echoing Emily's voice, but landing differently now, not as an accusation, but as an understanding. Memory was not always something lost. Sometimes it was something set aside because it did not fit the life being built. He lowered the photograph slowly, his fingers resting against the edge as if grounding himself in what had become undeniable. 6 years? Not measured in missed opportunities, but in a single choice repeated over time. To move forward without looking back. To build without returning. To leave without questioning what had been left behind. That pattern no longer held. He turned slightly as his assistant approached again, her presence quiet, respectful, waiting until he acknowledged her before speaking. "The car has departed," she said. "They will be home in 10 minutes. Alexander nodded once, the information settling into him not as a logistical detail, but as something more personal, a distance now defined not by separation, but by intention. "Clear my schedule tomorrow morning," he said after a moment, his voice steady, not rushed, but certain. "No meetings until noon." She paused briefly, not out of confusion, but because this request did not follow his usual pattern. Then she nodded. "Of course." He did not add anything further, did not explain, because for the first time, he was not rearranging his time for business or obligation. He was creating space. The kind that could not be delegated or managed by someone else. The kind that required him to show up fully, without distraction. He looked back at the city one more time, the lights unchanged, the movement steady, everything continuing as it always had. But something within him no longer aligned with that rhythm. For years he had believed that control meant knowing exactly where to stand, exactly when to move, exactly what to prioritize. Tonight had shown him something else. That sometimes the most important moments were the ones that did not ask for permission. The ones that arrived quietly and refused to be ignored. He folded the photograph carefully and placed it inside his jacket, not as evidence, not as proof, but as something that belonged with him now, something he would not set aside again. The room behind him continued to fill with sound, but he did not turn back immediately. He remained there for a moment longer, allowing the stillness to settle into something that felt unfamiliar but right. Then, finally, he moved, not with the same measured pace he had carried earlier, but with something steadier, something grounded. In a decision that had already been made. Somewhere 2 miles away, a boy with his name was finishing a quiet ride home, carrying nothing more than a simple promise. And for the first time, Alexander Reed understood that a name was not just something you carried. It was something you answered to. And this time, he was ready to answer.